that we're working on that is most tied perhaps to some of the things that this conference is most interested in is what we call secure business synchronization. And there we did this benchmarking study. We've done studies of security, which are enabled in some ways by the same types of, or which can be security services which can be enabled by technologies like RFIDs and sensors and real-time data gathering technologies. And I'm going to come back to the issue of synchronization towards the end of my presentation. And then the last theme that we're looking at is the theme of what happens with changing demographics. How does the aging population, at least in Western Europe and America, and even in China and Japan, impact the workforce? How does it impact consumption patterns? And you will see a series of studies coming out in this theme in the next few months. They're all in the final stages of production. And finally, we do some things that are very much what a business school would do. You know, write for Harvard Business Review. I think we have 3 articles coming this year, produce books in addition to the Innovator Solution. Governing by Network has been a great success in the public sector. And then support events like this and work with different conferences to engage the broader community with ideas that are partly developed in Deloitte, as well as stimulate the development of new ideas broadly. Now let me talk a little bit about the topic of synchronization. One of the most interesting findings out of our global benchmark survey across the firms were, I think, Peter, about 7% of the companies were about 73% more profitable than the remaining companies. And when the data was looked at, what we began to see was a pattern that those companies that had higher performance both synchronized within sort of 3 key processes: customer-facing, supply chain, and product development processes, but also began to synchronize across those processes. And they did that by investing in visibility and information across the processes and sharing information across the processes through collaboration. They invested in flexibility, and they invested in technology across those processes. And what we're beginning to do now is we're beginning to realize, in some ways, synchronization, at least for a series of companies out there, is emerging as a critical business challenge. It used to be that process reengineering was the challenge, and process reengineering was about blowing away the functional silos. If you remember Hammer, he would say, don't automate, obliterate. What we're beginning to realize is synchronization is really about perhaps overcoming process silos in order to get the right products to the right customers at the right margins at the right time. So what are we doing to study synchronization? We've been looking at a number of cases, the classical ones that, that are out there, like Zara, that has just been written up a few months ago, and HBR, the Dells, the Walmarts of the world. But what we're doing is we're looking at each of those links between those processes to understand how do you synchronize across them better under different contingencies. For example, when is it appropriate for a dynamic pricing strategy at the customer side in order to stabilize, the variability in the supply chain process? When is it appropriate in order to have a very sort of invested in flexibility in the production side, given that you might have tremendous delays in product development or in product launch because your customers may not be ready for product launch? In contrast, Zara develops a product, throws it out there, tests it, and if it begins to fly, they invest tremendously more in it. And what we also realize is one of the gaps that we find in the research on this area is that financial processes are not adequately linked to either supply chain, customer relationship, and product development processes. And the interrelationship between financial and risk management processes to these others are not looked at. So, Peter, myself, and others on my team are beginning to look at these interrelationships and trying to work out what we can do in terms of a contingent model that could help advise companies as to where should they focus synchronization efforts, and what different techniques might be available to them in order to do so, and what are the impacts of making specific choices on the broader system that they participate in. So here are some of the questions we're working on. What are the types of synchronization challenges across the links? What are the synchronization solutions across the links? What are the categories of them? And ways of reducing failures? How do you how do you get synchronization initiatives to work? Dynamic pricing at Dell is very interesting. They're able to pull it off, but most companies do not have very good connections between the supply chain folks and the CRM and the marketing folks to enable such a marketing strategy, such a dynamic pricing and a supply chain stabilization strategy to work. So what are the organizational factors that are required for synchronization to work? And then another thing we see is often companies invented a new business model that was fairly synchronized vis-a-vis synchronizing, if you like, to a new level of performance. So can companies go from where they are today to a major improvement of performance through synchronization efforts? Can they be successful at it? And what will that transformation journey look like? And how do you synchronize with resilience, if you like, given the world is often going to throw challenges and remains uncertain? So, in our manufacturing agenda, these are some of the questions that we're grappling with today. So let me talk about how you can participate and connect to Deloitte research. We do have the global benchmarking survey, and Kumar leads that in the India practice, and as a firm, we encourage you to participate in our research, and I think you will find interesting outcomes from the research that may give you insights on issues and ways of improving business performance. We encourage you to collaborate on workshops and events that we do. And finally, I suggest, logging in and connecting to Deloitte.com/research. We have all of the reports that we have done out there, and it also gives you a way to connect to our team and ask questions of our team. So with that, what I'd like to say is, once again, welcome to this conference. And I'd also just like to add one other thing. It's been 6 years since I've been back to India. I didn't grow up here, so I used to come fairly infrequently. And I'm just tremendously excited by the energy that I see in India across various businesses, in the students, in the people who are my colleagues at Deloitte, as we really build new industries and renew industries that exist. And from a Deloitte research perspective, we'll also be investing in building capability on the ground in India in the coming years. So we look forward to contributing research and working with the likes of ISB in building intellectual capital here. So thank you.
Administrative Staff College of India for 5 before that with various firms in India. In 1985, I did a study on the top 200 manufacturing firms in India. This was about 20 years ago. And there was very few private sector firms in that database which we created, and we found that the productivity growth, you really had to search for it. Most of the growth, because of labor, employment policies, you could rarely find any improvement in productivity. And the sector was growing, but not the productivity. And you almost wondered, when would the private sector make a showing. You always asked, when would the Indian firms file patents? Would they create something unique? And this was 20 years ago. So when I say the journey has been long, it has been a very rapid awakening probably, but it took 20 years. So about a couple of years ago, I think it started with Ajit was in my room. He had come to give a talk on a totally unrelated topic, which was, he has written a book on creating markets, which is a very interesting book on the electronic markets, and he had done a lot of study on that. He didn't tell you about it, but it's probably available on his website. So we were talking, and I said, look, Ajit, there's something funny happening in India. So he said, what? I said, look, several companies have won the Deming Award. And that started our look into India. We got a suspicion that Indian manufacturing sector was not really what it seemed to be, what it was in the past. Then he introduced me to Peter, and Peter, of course, introduced me to various lunches across New York and, and other things. And Anant out there. And we started interviewing people in India, CEOs, presidents of companies who had won prizes. And we found something was happening, but we're really not sure yet what. In the sense that people have made changes, people have achieved things, but it has happened so fast that I think from suspicion, we have gathered evidence to see that there has been a transformation in certain sectors. So we have some limited evidence that certain sectors have improved. Anant, for example, will be presenting a study we did with Harita, who is from ISB, on productivity improvement in the auto ancillary sector, and it's very tangible that there has been growth in productivity. Okay, but productivity is a vague concept. What is important is, if you look at the press in the US or everywhere else, they say Indian industries are, ready to take on the world stage. So that's all the hype. What we are looking for is hard evidence, data, which shows why, what, how it has happened. So I mean, words are one thing, metrics are another, and that's precisely what we're trying to do. So this is part of a journey trying to gather evidence that where has the improvement taken place. That's what's happening. While we are doing this, see, the nice thing for a researcher is that when I look at it, there's so much work to be done to understand the sector, to understand what's unique. So that's a good thing for a researcher, which means I have enough work for the next several years to study the Indian manufacturing sector, which I think is poised for growth. But what we would like to do is start this as the beginning of a systematic way of studying the industry, of various industries, trying to look at best practices, trying to look at what's so unique about India, especially with its severe disadvantages, because it's geographically located so far away, and it's also isolated from the mainstream, politics. It's very interesting how it is coming back into the fold, because most of the big markets are very far away. Only if you sit on a plane and fly 24 hours, you see the difference, how far it really is. So that's the good news. The good news for all of us who are doing research is there's a lot of work, and if we can do it in a nice way, without maybe at least qualitative studies, quantitative studies, create enough evidence that things are happening and why it's so uniquely Indian. That would be, I think, the good thing, because people are still asking, well, the Indians are coming, but why are they coming? I mean, what's so special about these people? That's what I think we need to understand. And so without further thoughts on what we want to do, I only want to assure you that we are here to stay for a few more years studying this subject before we switch somewhere else maybe. But Anant and I am sure we would love to continue talking to any one of you who wants to do research in this area. This session, I think, is somewhat reflective of what I've been trying to say, because it's got 4 pieces to it, and all 4 pieces are important. The first one is the pure productivity piece that Anant is going to talk about on its actual measures of how the industry has improved, and you'll be, I'm sure, slightly surprised at least about what's happening. Jeff, who is here, has come again a very long way to talk to us. He has been always interested, I believe, in Asia and in India and China, and he's going to give the perspective of GM, and GM has just said they're going to buy $1 billion from India, and probably he'll tell us why. So he'll give us, what does the West really think of India, and why do they come here? Okay. Nitin is going to talk about something which is very important. Maybe I'll touch upon it in the panel, but he's going to look at many of the successful companies, if I'm not mistaken, have managed to create their own environment to operate successfully. You don't have to look beyond ISB to understand that, because ISB has created this very delightful environment, and I hear participants complaining, look, it's a jungle, but you know, it's a nice place to be in and do research. So this is the kind of thing where you're able to isolate external environment and create development. Maybe that's the Indian thing we're looking for, but not too far away from the city. Finally, Arun